Good evening, it's Tuesday, January 17th. Welcome to a new episode of System Update, our new live nightly show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively here on Rumble, the free speech alternative to YouTube. We were off last night for the holiday, but are back and excited to present our new show tonight. For tonight, we report on one of the creepiest bills yet proposed from Chief Sponsor Sheila Jackson Lee, the House Democrat from Texas, that is designed to both codify and glorify racism in the name of anti-racism, while fulfilling its ultimate goal, namely criminalizing speech in a way that is clearly designed to circumvent the core limits of the First Amendment's free speech clause. We wish we could say that this bill was some warped and isolated aberration, but while it is undoubtedly warped, there's nothing aberrational about it. It is part of a clear global trend to use not just social pressure, but the force of law to criminalize all forms of online speech, all while masquerading overt racism as some noble form of anti-racism. For our interview segment, we will speak to former White House speechwriter and editor of the Revolver News, Darren Beattie, about the very interesting and somehow odd phenomenon of Lex Fridman, who seemingly overnight has become one of the most popular podcasts and YouTube hosts in the world, for reasons that are far from clear, as he compiles millions and millions and millions of views and has access to some of the world's most powerful and elusive guests. We'll talk to Darren about why that has happened and what that reflects, as well as both the potential benefits and pitfalls of the new church committee that House Republicans are implementing. Finally, we'll conclude the show with a look at the fallout, very substantial and intense fallout, from our exclusive report on Friday night right here about a secret and extraordinary order issued by a member of Brazil's Supreme Court ordering multiple American social media platforms, including this one, Rumble, to immediately ban numerous prominent Brazilian politicians and journalists without so much as a trial or any process at all or even an explanation. The reaction in Brazil to our report has been as vitriolic and hateful as any report I've ever done, and we'll examine why that is. As always, as soon as we're done with our one-hour show here on Rumble, we will move to locals for our interactive after show to take your questions and comment on your feedback. For now, welcome to a new episode of System Update, starting right now. On March 12, 2021, one of the most shockingly discriminatory and racist bills in decades was passed by the U.S. Congress and then signed into law by President Joe Biden. The law, justified by the COVID pandemic, was the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan. It was passed strictly on party lines. All House Democrats except for one voted for it, as did all Senate Democrats. All Republicans in both houses opposed it. The bill contained a hodgepodge of payouts, loans, and small business relief with the goal, said President Biden upon signing it, of, quote, giving people in this nation, working people, middle-class folks who built the country, a fighting chance. Now, buried within this massive bill, enacted just 8 months after the George Floyd murder, was an overtly racist provision masquerading under the guise of anti-racism. One section of that bill allocated $29 billion for what it called the Restaurant Revitalization Fund. Now, as most of you know, restaurants were going bankrupt or otherwise struggling greatly during the pandemic. Restaurants don't do well when everyone's locked down in their house. And most people, according to polls, were supportive of temporary aid from the federal government to keep those restaurants and other small businesses afloat. But what received little attention at the time of passage of that bill was the scheme for determining which restaurants would receive priority for receiving aid. There were far more restaurants in need of aid to help them all with that allocated $29 billion. So there needed to be a way to determine which restaurants would receive priority before the funds ran out, such as first come, first serve, or a lottery, or trying to help the restaurants most near bankruptcy. But none of those methods was used by Congress when it enacted this bill. Instead, what determined where a restaurant would fall on the priority list was the color, race, ethnicity, and gender of its owners. Specifically, as I wrote at the time when we reported on it, the law granted priority status to restaurants that have 51% ownership or more, composed of specific racial and ethnic groups as well as women. A lawsuit against the Biden administration over this bill, the Small Business Administration, was brought by a married couple, the Vitolos, who were owners of a small restaurant, Jake's Bar and Grill, which desperately needed assistance in order to survive. But unfortunately for them, they were relegated to the back of the line because they were not the right race, ethnicity, or gender. The wife, who qualified as a member of a marginalized group under the law's scheme of gender preferences, only owned 50% of the restaurant, while her white husband, who owned the other 50%, got no points. If she had owned 51% instead of 50%, or if her husband had been of a different race, they would have received priority eligibility for the loan. Instead, they were able to receive assistance only if there was any money left in the fund after all the other restaurants with the right gender and race composition first received their requested loans. Now, as we reported at the time in that article, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, where this lawsuit alleging unconstitutional racial and gender discrimination ended up, made the perversity of the law extremely clear. Quote, "The Vitola's restaurant," said the court, quote, "has struggled during the pandemic. It closed on weekdays and offered to-go orders on weekends. It lost workers and a considerable amount in sales. For that reason, they filed their application for a grant under the COVID relief bill on the very first day the Small Business Administration accepted applications, which was May 1st. But under the law, their application could not be considered until the 21-day period reserved for priority businesses elapsed. If, as was likely, all of the allocated grant money was exhausted during that designated 21-day period, as the Vitolas feared, then Jake's Bar and Grill and other non-minority-owned struggling businesses would receive no relief, solely because of the racial and gender composition of their ownership. Now, the three-judge panel in the Sixth Circuit ruled in favor of the Vitolas and struck down these preferences on the grounds that they violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which guarantees, quote, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." Now, notably, the majority opinion invalidating this law as racist and discriminatory was Almond Thapper, who made history in 2008 when he was nominated by George W. Bush to the federal court and became the first ever South Asian judge appointed to the U.S. federal bench. The son of immigrants from India, his father owned an air conditioning supply business in Toledo, and he was elevated to the circuit court in 2017 by President Trump. To argue that the law was not just offensive and racist, but unconstitutional, Judge Thapper several times referenced his own ethnicity and explained the perversity of the law this way, quote, "Individuals who trace their ancestry to Pakistan and India qualify for special treatment, but those from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Iran do not. Those from China, Japan, and Hong Kong all qualify, but those from Tunisia, Libya, and Morocco do not." The judge went on, quote, "Imagine two childhood friends, one Indian, one Afghan. Both own restaurants, and both have suffered devastating losses during the pandemic. If both apply to the Restaurant Revitalization Fund, the Indian applicant will presumptively receive priority consideration over his Afghan friend. Why? Because of his ethnic heritage. It is indeed a, quote, sordid business to divide us, quote, up by race," the judge wrote, citing the Supreme Court's 2006 opinion in League of United Latin American Citizens versus Perry. "And the government's attempt to do so violates the Constitution," he said. Now, as we wrote when reporting on this case, quote, "The court also noted how bizarre it is to prioritize women even if they come from extremely wealthy families or are themselves extremely rich. And the notion that all non-white business owners are inherently more in need than white business owners, aside from being exactly the type of racial stereotypes and preferences the 14th Amendment was designed to prohibit, wilts upon the most minimal scrutiny. Indeed, if one were to divide Americans by ethnic group to determine the highest median household income in the U.S., one would find that the top 8 highest earning groups in the United States are non-white. Indian Americans, Filipinos, Sri Lankans, Japanese, Malaysian, Chinese, and Pakistani Americans. Only then does one arrive at white Americans, which this law placed at the back of the bus for receiving help from the federal government, even if they were struggling immensely in the time of this pandemic. Now, this was not the first law, this federal law, to preference one certain citizens over others based on race. Here, you see a New York Times article that reports on one such law. We're going to bring that up in just a second. That is from January 3rd, 2021. And there you see the title, quote, "A COVID-19 relief fund was only for black residents. Then came the lawsuits. Oregon earmarked $62 billion to explicitly benefit black individuals and business owners. Now some of the money is in limbo after lawsuits alleging racial discrimination. And those lawsuits were not brought only by white business owners, but also by Latino business owners and businesses of other non-white races who were barred from receiving these funds by this Oregon law." Quote, "After convening several virtual meetings, the civic leaders proposed a bold and novel solution that state lawmakers approved in July. The state would earmark $62 million of its $1.4 billion in federal COVID-19 relief money to provide grants to black residents, business owners, and community organizations enduring pandemic-related hardships. It was finally being honest. This is who needs this support right now," said Lou Frederick, a state senator who is black. Quote, "But now millions of dollars in grants are on hold after one Mexican American and 2 white business owners sued the state, arguing that the fund for black residents discriminated against them." Now, the Oregon state courts ended up rejecting that claim based on reasoning that would cause pain if you were to actually read it. We actually covered the rationale in that article we wrote about the Sixth Circuit opinion, where there was one dissenting judge appointed by President Obama who would have upheld the racially discriminatory COVID relief law that the 2 judges of the Sixth Circuit ended up invalidating. But what's really crucial to note here is that, especially after the George Floyd protest and the months of Black Lives Matter protests that it led to, this idea began to be created that the solution to racism in the United States was to further divide Americans by race, sometimes putting only 2 groups, white citizens here and non-white citizens here, but most of the time dividing them even further by priority. So, for example, as the judge noted in the Sixth Circuit case, not all non-white citizens got priority, but only certain kinds of non-white citizens who were from some countries but not from others. And this became essentially the way in which we began to look at racism in the United States, that the way to solve it was through overtly racist laws and bills that sometimes made no sense on their own. Why would you favor one group of non-white citizens over another white group of non-white citizens if your claim is that you're trying to combat white supremacism, as happened in Oregon and has happened in the COVID relief bill? Now, at exactly the same time that this is happening and proliferating, this idea that the way to stop racism is through more aggressive racism, we also are enduring this idea that when one person goes and commits a violent crime, the person who is guilty of that crime is not just the person who goes and engages the violence, but also anyone who spouted ideas that can somehow be said to inspire that person or in some way be linked to their ideology. Back in May of last year, we published an article on Substack that was headlined "The Demented and Selective Game of Instantly Blaming Political Opponents for Mass Shootings." And as we noted there, quote, all ideology spawns psychopaths who kill innocents in its name, yet only some are blamed for their violent adherence, by opportunists cravenly exploiting corpses while they still lie on the ground. We saw that most recently in November of last year when a person went into a gay bar in Colorado Springs and killed 5 people, and it was immediately asserted that the fault lay not with the murderer himself, or I'm sorry, themselves. They identify as non-binary, not just with the murderer themselves, but with anybody who in any way has ever questioned any part of the LGBT agenda, because that opposition, this narrative went, is what inspired people like that to go on these shooting sprees, and they were essentially as guilty as the shooter himself. That was the claim that arose in that case, even though here we are 2 or 3 months later, and we still have no evidence at all of what that person's motive actually was. The media instantly claimed it was due to anti-gay animus, when in reality there never was any evidence at the time that that claim was being made, nor 3 months later is there. But the idea was to try and link or blame one's political opponents for violent acts carried out in some way associated with the political opponent's views. Now, it is very notable that this only goes in one direction. Because as I said, any kind of political ideology has the capacity to spawn fanatics who engage in violence in the name of that ideology. In 2017, a leftist American, James Hodgkinson, went to a softball field where he knew Republican members of Congress played softball every Saturday, and he shot several of them, one of whom, Steve Scalise, the House Republican whip, almost died. And as it turned out, this person who did the shooting was a fanatical fan of Rachel Maddow. He watched her show every night. He was also an ardent fan of Bernie Sanders. He worked for the Bernie Sanders campaign as a volunteer. And his Facebook publishings and his letters over the years shows that he was contaminated by everything Rachel Maddow was saying. He would claim all the time on Facebook and in his letters to the editor of his local paper that Republicans were captive to Russia, that they were serving the agenda of Moscow, that they were the party of white supremacy, that they were the party bent on fascism. And so he went and committed these horrific crimes, trying to murder Steve Scalise, shooting 3 other people in the name of left-wing ideology, in the name of the ideology that Rachel Maddow spouts every night on her MSNBC show, and that Bernie Sanders has spent his whole career advocating. And yet nobody serious or rational would try and say that Rachel Maddow or Bernie Sanders has blood on their hands for having inspired this person to go and do this. Nor would anybody ever say that in 2002, when a very popular right-wing Dutch politician, Pim Fortuyn, who was an openly gay politician but had moved to the right on issues like immigration, was preparing to run for president. There were elections coming up. He and his party were favored to win a lot of seats and perhaps one day could have become prime minister of the Netherlands. He was shot and killed multiple times in a savage and barbaric murder on the street by a self-identified leftist who was an environmentalist and a vegan. And he shot him in the name of left-wing ideology. He confessed to the killing and said the reason he did it was because he thought Pim Fortuyn was a dangerous figure because of his Islamophobia, because of his attempt to demonize and blame Muslims and try and limit immigration to Holland in the name of Islamophobia. Obviously, an ideology that was frequently heard by every left-wing and liberal commentator and politician in the Netherlands, that Pim Fortuyn was a dangerous demagogue and somebody who was Islamophobic. So he went and carried out this murder, this assassination that was barbaric and savage in the name of left-wing ideology, and yet I don't think anybody blamed left-wing politicians or commentators in the Netherlands, because it's absurd, it's insane to try and say that if you argue in a defense of your ideology, but don't encourage anybody to go and murder in the name of that ideology, but someone who hears you does in fact go and murder, that somehow you are responsible. So whenever that happens on the left, and it does, there's an easy differentiation made between the person who went and did the violence and the person who advocated the views in whose name that person went and murdered. And as I've said, this has been going on for a long time. One of the cases on which I most relied as a constitutional lawyer was a 1982 unanimous decision by the Supreme Court that ruled in favor of NAACP leaders in Mississippi when the state of Mississippi sued the leaders of the local chapter of the NAACP, alleging that they were giving very fiery and inflammatory speeches in favor of their boycotts. And some of the people who heard those speeches, members of the NAACP, went and engaged in violence and burned down stores. And they tried to hold those leaders of the NAACP responsible. And the Supreme Court in 1982 said, you can't hold people responsible morally or legally for the violent consequences of their protected speech. The leaders of the NAACP were advocating what they had every right to advocate, which is a boycott of stores, white-owned stores, in order to address racial inequality. The fact that other people heard those views and got inspired to go commit violence doesn't mean you can blame those people, because otherwise the First Amendment would have no meaning at all. If I were, for example, to stand up and say, I think abortion is a fundamental human right, and people who are opposed to abortion are putting the lives of women in danger, it's very possible that one of you who hear me out there listening might believe me and think, you know what, he's right. Anti-abortion activists are dangerous. They put women at risk. And one of you might go and bomb an anti-abortion or pro-life office, as has happened several times in the last 12 months. But the idea that I could be held responsible for expressing my First Amendment views about abortion, even if it can be proven that I did go and inspire that person to do so, is obscene. It would mean that nobody could actually safely express their ideology out of fear that someone who hears it goes and commits violence and then they're held responsible. And yet, every time on the right, when somebody goes and commits murder, like happened in Buffalo last year, when a white person in the name of white supremacy and the white replacement theory went and murdered on purpose 10 people in a grocery store that was a predominantly African-American neighborhood, there was an immediate attempt to say that not only he, but Tucker Carlson and other commentators were somehow responsible, even though there was no evidence that that person had ever heard those shows, let alone agreed with those people or were inspired by them in any way. It's a very dangerous and a more immoral attempt to criminalize speech through the back door by saying that your views and your speaking out about your views is inspiring other people to go commit violence, and therefore you should be held at least reputationally and morally responsible, and perhaps even criminally. So now you have these two very pernicious trends. On the one hand, to glorify overt racism in the laws, anti-racism, and on the other, an attempt to try and criminalize people's speech by linking them to people who go and commit violence in the name of their views. And it culminates in an incredibly dangerous new law that is now being proposed by a very mainstream member of the Democratic Party in the House, Sheila Jackson Lee. She's not part of the squad. She's in the House Progressive Caucus, the Black Congressional Caucus, but she's by no means an outlier in the Democratic Party. She's a very kind of standard mainstream Democrat. She's been there forever. She votes the way leadership tells her to. She's never off key in any way. And she has this bill that she just proposed this week. The title of it is H.R. 61, Leading Against White Supremacy Act of 2023, and it's now been referred to the House Judiciary Committee for action. And I want to show you what this bill does, because to say that it's chilling and dangerous is to severely understate the case. And while it's unlikely, to put it mildly, this bill will see a House floor vote in the next 2 years now that House Republicans control the Congress, it very well could easily change. But it also reflects where the Democratic Party is when it comes to issues of both racism and free speech. So I really want to show you what this bill does, given how pernicious it is. And it's a bill that is now pending in the Congress. The purported purpose of this bill is, quote, to prevent and prosecute white supremacy-inspired hate crime and conspiracy to commit white supremacy-inspired hate crime, and to amend Title 18 United States Code to expand the scope of hate crimes. Now, notice, hate crimes are already illegal. If you go into a grocery store in Buffalo with the intention of murdering African Americans, or a church in Charleston, or a gay bar with the intention to kill LGBTs, you are already committing crimes under the federal statute, including hate crimes. That is already criminalized. You don't need a bill to do that. What this seeks to do is expand how you become guilty of hate crimes. Specifically, you don't have to any longer be the one to pull the trigger. All you have to have done is express a view that the government can assert not only did inspire someone to commit a hate crime, but even if they didn't do it, had the potential to do it. And if you don't believe that, if you think that I'm exaggerating here, look at what this bill says. Here's section 2. It's entitled White Supremacy Inspired Hate Crime. Quote, A, in general, a person engages in a white supremacy inspired hate crime. This is a new crime, a white supremacy inspired hate crime, when white supremacy ideology has motivated the planning, development, preparation, or perpetration of actions that constituted a crime or were undertaken in furtherance of activity that, if effectuated, would have constituted a crime. So now listen to this. You don't actually need a crime in order to have a hate crime. It just has to be somebody who has begun planning, developing, or preparing actions that, had they been carried out, would have constituted a hate crime. And you've now become part of, here it is in B, a conspirator in this crime. You become part of a conspiracy to engage in this new crime, white supremacy inspired hate crime. It says a conspiracy to engage in white supremacy hate crime shall be determined to exist between two or more persons engaged in the planning, preparation, or perpetration of a white supremacy inspired hate crime. That makes sense. If you and someone else are planning to go murder black people or gay people or Asian people, and you go and buy guns and set out on the plan, that makes sense. That's now a conspiracy. But here's how else you can become a conspirator in hate crimes. That's number one, two people who are actually doing the planning. Number two, between two or more persons, A, at least one of whom engaged in the planning, development, and preparation. So you need a person who's doing the planning. And then B, at least one of whom published materials advancing white supremacy, white supremacist ideology, antagonism based on replacement theory, or hate speech that vilifies or is otherwise directed against any non-white person or group, and such published material was published on a social media platform or by other means of publication with the likelihood that it would be viewed by persons who are predisposed to engage in a hate crime, or could, as determined by a reasonable person, motivate actions by a person predisposed to engaging in white supremacy hate crime, or 3, was read, heard, or viewed by a person who engaged in the development, planning, preparation, or perpetration of a white supremacy inspired hate crime. In other words, if you go onto Twitter and you express a view that Barbara Lee or whoever is or Sheila Jackson Lee or whoever is deciding considers your view to be racist or white supremacist, even if somebody doesn't hear you and then goes and commits a crime, even if that doesn't happen, you are a conspirator in a hate crime as long as it was reasonably likely that somebody who might commit a hate crime heard you or heard your views. Now, where wouldn't that be true? It's always the case that any ideology or any viewpoint that you express has the potential to be heard by somebody who could, in the name of that ideology, go and commit crimes. I'm vegan. I advocate for veganism. I try not to be annoying about it or preachy about it. But the reason I'm vegan is because I believe the factory farming industry commits gratuitous cruelty to animals. So imagine I go online and I say the factory farming industry is evil, it's a threat to the public health, and it gratuitously tortures animals, and it vandalizes family farms and what family farms were designed to do, all of which I believe. There's a potential that someone might hear me and go and bomb a factory farm, even if I don't suggest that. So in every instance where you express an opinion, you're automatically guilty of publishing material where it's likely that it would be viewed by persons who are predisposed to engaging in that crime. It basically circumvents the First Amendment by allowing you to be prosecuted as a conspirator in a hate crime for expressing a view that Democrats judge as racist or white supremacist. Now, as we all know, there are very few views that Democrats won't call racist or white supremacist if they disagree with those views. But to try and have federal legislation that turns you into a conspiracist when your only role in the conspiracy is to express a view that's protected by the First Amendment is remarkably dangerous. And it also raises the question, why is this confined only to white supremacy racism? Why doesn't it apply to anti-Semitic views that motivate anti-Semitic crimes? Or why doesn't it apply to anti-Asian views that can motivate anti-Asian crimes? And for that matter, why doesn't it apply to somebody who goes online and says white people are evil, white people are primitive, white people deserve to be killed, and then someone hears that person and goes and commits crime specifically aimed at white people? It's both the kind of overt racism disguised as anti-racism that we began the show talking about, joined at the hip by an attempt to criminalize speech by turning protected expression of views into a crime. This is a really pernicious bill that's pending. And it also wants to take two actual hate crime legislations, one specifically the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act, and amend it to add this language. By the way, Matthew Shepard is one of those people who was murdered in a way that everyone asserted at the time was murdered because of 3 or 4 white straight men who hated gay people, and it turns out that story is far murkier than was originally suggested. But I'll just leave that for another day. We went over that a little bit when I explained to you how the lie about the Pulse killing in Orlando, namely that person, Omar Mateen, who went to the Pulse nightclub, went there to kill gay people, when it turned out that wasn't his motive at all. But this legislation is extremely dangerous. Here you see the hate crime law already in effect that makes it a very serious felony to commit a hate crime. This is the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Act that she wants to amend. Here you see the hate crime defined. It's a person who willfully causes bodily injury to any person through the use of a firearm, or a dangerous weapon because of the actual or perceived race, color, religion, or national origin of any person. They shall be imprisoned not more than 10 years, etc., or shall be imprisoned for any term of years or for life, or actually, if death results from the offense, you can have a life sentence. So now they want to amend this to make you part of this statute, guilty under it, if you express views, not even that inspire crime, but that has the potential to do so. But note, only certain kinds of views, not all kinds of views. Now, even though there's no risk probably that this is going to get enacted in the next 2 years, this bill isn't going anywhere. And the mentality behind it, which is we need to criminalize speech on the internet, is global. This has been done by every tyrannical government all over the world. Here in October 2019 is an NPR article on how Singapore has implemented a fake news law worrying free speech activists. So apparently we're able to recognize a threat to free speech when it's in obviously authoritarian countries like Singapore. Quote, in Singapore, a law intended to crack down on, quote, fake news went into effect Wednesday, much to the dismay of free speech advocates and journalists. The Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act, which passed the country's parliament in May, requires online platforms to issue corrections or remove content that the government deems false. Media companies that fail to comply face a fine of up to 1 million Singapore dollars, about $722,000. This is what Homeland Security in the United States is trying to do, what that disinformations are. Put itself in the position of being the official arbiter of what's true and false, and then make it a crime for social media platforms to allow online anything that the government deems false. Here too, in the United Arab Emirates, quote, UAE prosecutors warn the public over hate speech penalties. A person found to have published offensive material would face substantial fine and jail time. Now, you might guess that the Emiratis don't exactly care about persecution of minorities. That's not their intent here. Few governments in the world persecute minorities more than the United Arab Emirates. The whole country is built on the backs of slave labor, just like its neighbor Qatar is. This bill instead, quote, UAE residents who spread hate speech relating to religion, race, or culture will face major fines and jail time, federal prosecutors have warned. Publishing hate speech material online or in physical documents could land offenders with at least 1 year in jail and a minimum fine of 50,000, the currency of the UAE. Now, dinars actually is what it is. Now, here too is from the International Press Institute. Jordan approves indefinite, quote, defense law banning rumors and false news. So does anyone in the United States or Western countries who want these laws to criminalize fake news, hate speech, and the like ever wonder why it is that the exact same laws have already been implemented by all of the most despotic and tyrannical countries on the planet? Obviously, it's not because they want to protect marginalized groups. It's because they want to control the internet and be able to criminalize speech. And that's exactly what the United States is trying to do as well. Now here, just as a reminder that it's not confined to Middle Eastern countries or others on a continent, is an outstanding article that's found on Substack by a Canadian, I believe he's a legal commentator, Carl Stack. And it's from December 3rd, 2022, so just last month. And it's entitled A Legislative Onslaught Against Press Freedom in Canada. Bills C11, C18, C21, 26, and C36 will turn Canada into an authoritarian hellscape. The Trudeau government has been seizing this power exactly. Remember, it was the Justin Trudeau government that arrogated into itself the power to freeze bank accounts of peaceful protesters participating in a protest against the government's COVID policies. This is now what they're trying to do on the internet. Rumble used to be a Canadian company. It was founded by a Canadian liberal, a very ordinary Canadian liberal who had ordinary politics in 2013. He was Canadian. It founded it as a Canadian company, Rumble. And over the years, he started realizing that you cannot be a social media company that wants to protect free speech and be in Canada, because the laws are so insane that you can be held criminally responsible if you don't censor on the commands of the government. Now remember that on Friday night show, and we're going to end our segment, end the last segment with this, we reported on what's happening in Brazil, where a single judge on the Supreme Court has been given unchallengeable and absolute power to have any content that he wants or any person that he wants banned online. Although the orders are secret and therefore nobody had seen them, we got a hold of one on Friday night and we showed you what it says. It's incredibly chilling, these powers, because this is now no longer just having a New York Times article about how Facebook has blood on their hands if they don't censor more. That kind of social pressure that the media in the United States has created to agitate for censorship. This is now using the force of law in order to criminalize speech. We are supposed to be immunized from these kind of dangers by the First Amendment, and yet the bill that Sheila Jackson Lee just proposed and is the chief sponsor of, and I guarantee you it would be almost impossible to find a House Democrat willing to condemn that, let alone vote against it, is a way to circumvent the First Amendment by saying that we now have the power to criminalize speech because certain kinds of speech we're going to make as a conspiracy in crime. And on top of that, we're going to make it a racist law by only protecting certain segments of the population, not others, in the name of anti-racism. So this is why on Friday we told you, if you're not Brazilian, doesn't mean that you should ignore the reporting we did on Brazil's crisis of censorship, the regime of censorship, because all of this is global. One country sees how dangerous the internet is to authority, and then they all copy one another and their tactics for trying to control the internet, to try to limit and criminalize free speech on it, because nothing is more dangerous to free speech, and it is always the case whenever there's a technology that emerges that empowers the citizenry to stand up to power centers and the establishment. By definition, power centers and the establishment look for ways to take back that power, and the way they're using now is to try and allow you to be prosecuted for expressing views deemed too dangerous for the internet. If you spent any time on YouTube or Twitter lately, and the chances are you probably have, you likely have noticed that the name Lex Fridman has become nearly ubiquitous and inescapable virtually overnight. Fridman is a podcaster who has amassed a very large audience, largely by conducting long interviews, very long, sometimes 7 or 8 hours, with high-profile names in entertainment, tech, politics, and media. His interviews are especially popular and heavily promoted on YouTube, where his videos regularly amass millions of views. I saw on Twitter someone saying, Lex Fridman is who you wake up to if you fall asleep listening to a podcast on YouTube. The algorithms will shove him down your throat. Fridman is also known for his anodyne, kumbaya, peace, love, and centrism approach to today's most controversial and thorny debates. For our interview segment tonight, though, I'm not talking to Lex Fridman. I hope to one day, I guess. But I'm instead talking to Darren Beattie, a journalist at Revolver News and a former White House speechwriter who has recently taken up the important crusade of deconstructing Fridman's astonishing and perplexing rise in today's media and tech landscape. And while he reserves a few criticisms for Fridman himself, his primary critique is of the algorithmic landscape that seems to constantly promote and serve up this type of content while demoting other forms of less establishment-friendly commentary. I'll also speak to Darren about the House Republicans' newly announced Church Committee 2.0, which plans to investigate and shed light on the abuses, overreach, and politicization of the U.S. national security state. I'm excited to talk to Darren. He always has interesting things to say, and he is up right now.
Great to be here.
Yeah, it's good to be with you. Thanks this is your debut appearance on System Update, although it's not your first time being interviewed by me on Rumble. The interview that we did on the FBI's role on January 6th, I think, was the most watched video, one of the most watched in the history of Rumble. It's acquired more than 3.5 million views. I don't know if we'll do as well with this interview, but I hope we do. But thanks for joining us.
Well, we will if we have the Lex algorithms on our side. So let's.
Everyone succeeds with the Lex algorithms. So there probably are a few lucky people out there who have managed not to hear about Lex Fridman or have not heard enough to form an opinion. So before we dive into what I do think is the interesting question of kind of what accounts for his popularity, without even needing to bash him, just it's an interesting question. Explain who he is and why he's worth talking about.
So, yeah, there's so many things here, but yes, Lex Fridman is probably one of the most popular podcasters, YouTubers around. He gets the highest profile guests imaginable. Elon has been on there like 4 times. Elon loves him. Joe Rogan eats out of his hand. There's a famous clip on YouTube of Joe Rogan just giving Lex his favorite watch, which I encourage everyone to watch. It's like the scene from Pulp Fiction when Christopher Walken gives a kid a watch. It's incredible. And everyone's just incredibly deferential to the guy. He's had Mark Zuckerberg
just to interrupt
on.
you there. You know, I've been a fan of Joe Rogan for a long time, been on the show. I defended him, but the thing that was so amazing about the clip, just to be clear, so people don't get confused, it wasn't like it was a birthday present or like a Christmas present. It was just Joe Rogan taking his most expensive and admired watch and giving it to Lex Fridman for no reason other than as a means of expressing his, I guess you could call it, reverence for him or his desire to please him. It was bizarre to watch.
It's incredibly weird. And I actually like Rogan. I look at Rogan, I understand why he's so successful.
Right.
He has a genuine talent to organically resonate with the masses. He asks the question that the masses resonate with. He's excellent conversationally, and he's reached the highest level of multiple different domains, which is a very difficult thing to do. Nonetheless, in my critique of Lex, I've used the term Rogan brained to refer to the kind of general sort of Rogan's, extended universe, extended Rogan cinematic universe that sort of encompasses and celebrates Lex. But you're right, there's a very weird clip of Rogan just totally deferential to Lex. Elon's deferential. He has the best guess, but the thing is there's no discernible talent when it comes to Lex as opposed to somebody like Rogan. He's, people can judge for themselves, but he's not engaging. He's not charismatic. He markets himself as this MIT AI researcher, and there's a lot of questions there. He comes from Drexel University. I think he gave like one lecture at MIT, which was a guest lecture or not even that big of a deal. And now his whole shtick is, I'm the MIT basically professor guy, interviewing all of these high profile people who, for whatever reason, agree to be on his podcast. But the strangest thing, and the reason why I focus on him, is not to be mean to him. He could be a great person. He could be a genuinely good person. It's not personal. It just kind of became personal because when you notice someone has an incredibly thin skin on the internet, there's sort of, a temptation to keep pressing. And in his case, it's definitely punching up because he's the most algorithmically promoted person on the entire internet. And that's really sort of the meta significance of this critique. It's not about one individual. It's about how anyone can be plucked out of nowhere with no discernible talent. And the powers of the algorithms driving content curation is so formidable that it supersedes any kind of consideration of organic human talent. And it just becomes totally dispositive in terms of how it determines what type of information people are exposed to. It's just like a continuous, like, TED Talk over and over, the eternal recurrence of TED Talk profundity, TED Talk pseudo profundity. And that, I think, is a very dangerous thing, not only for just online discourse, for conversation, but I think it represents a larger sort of degradation of humanity that is happening with the help of sort of algorithmically driven everything.
Yeah, we focus a lot on the power of big tech in terms of its impact when it comes to censoring content. And that is obviously a huge deal. The ability to eliminate certain ideas and certain voices from mainstream discourse is one of the most potent powers you can wield. And we don't spend much time thinking about the converse, which is at least as consequential, which is the ability through algorithms of especially Google's YouTube and Facebook and the like to promote things in people. Like I said, I mean, the reason I remember that tweet, which is Lex Fridman is the person you wake up to if you fall asleep watching a podcast, is because I can't tell you how many times that has happened to me. And look,
yes,
I can't watch Lex Fridman for more than 10 minutes. No, it doesn't bother me. It just bores me. And that's fine. Like, it's totally subjective, like who you find interesting and who you don't. The fact that he bores me doesn't mean he's boring. It might mean that he's just interesting to a lot of other people. I accept that. But clearly, the thing that strikes me so much too is it isn't just that he gets a lot of amazing guests now that are very hard to get. His 8th episode was with Eric Schmidt, the longtime CEO of Google, who's now chairman of Google, who's one of the most powerful people on the planet, and who's very elusive as a guest. I mean, he's very difficult to interview. He has a very kind of harsh and radical politics. And I also don't care about credentials, because some people with enormous and impressive credentials are incredibly platitudinous and unimpressive, and many people with no credentials are some of the people most worth listening to. But the appeal of him was supposed to be he's a genius. He stands in front of that chalkboard at MIT with the equations that other people have said are not only incredibly simplistic, but were not done by him. So there seems to be a little bit of kind of tinkering with the resume or manipulation of the image. I'm just wondering what you make of all of this. Like, who is this serving and how did this happen? Why are the algorithms promoting not just him, but people like him?
Well, even the notorious exaggerator, the notorious embellisher, Congressman George Santos, it never even occurred to him with his level of chutzpah to represent himself as an MIT professor researching AI. That's reserved for Lex Fridman. And again, it's not about snobbish credentialism. It's that the guy literally lectured at MIT. Maybe once it was some weird sponsored lectureship. Multiple people have done this. A rapper called Fiasco did it. And the funny thing, he was standing in front of the same blackboard. I have fans at MIT. I could easily get one to say, hey, come and give a talk. I'll reserve a room for you. We'll make sure it's after maybe a differential topology class or something. So we have nice arcane symbols on the blackboard. You can give your spiel about Ray Epps and January 6th. And then afterwards, my whole persona is the MIT professor who, talked about January 6th. It's very disingenuous. And what's weird is that so many ultra high profile people go along with it. And that's what's interesting. The algorithmically driven aspect is interesting, especially in light of a conversation that I'll try to pull up later, and I'll send it to you when I find it. But it was a conversation with Susan Wojcicki, or however you say the last name of the CEO of YouTube. And people were grilling her and saying, why do you allow Ben Shapiro on YouTube? Why don't you censor him? Why is he so algorithmically promoted? Because he is, along with Jordan Peterson as well. This is the Rogan extended cinematic universe, as I was describing. And why are they so algorithmically promoted? And she said, look, I know, Ben Shapiro says a lot of things that are reprehensible. He's transphobic, yada, yada, yada. But our research shows that his content has a de-radicalizing effect on people who have an interest in right-wing content. And that's why we ensure that whenever somebody watches something that's maybe a little bit spicier on YouTube, the algorithm takes them to Ben Shapiro to kind of be the chaser to the shot of whatever kind of naughty thing you were listening to beforehand. And I strongly suspect that there's a similar type of logic, maybe somewhat modified, behind the algorithmic apotheosis of Lex Fridman. Does that explain why, according to sources close to Joe Rogan, that they've never seen Rogan so deferential to somebody? Does it explain why Elon's so deferential? There could be more to the story. And, it's just an interesting thing how handlers emerge, how some people emerge out of nowhere, but that's very speculative territory. What is clear is that he's not an organic presence, and that in order for us to continue to have a meaningful human society on the internet, we can't be completely controlled by these algorithms in a way that we don't completely understand. And that's what's most offensive and I think most dangerous about this sort of broader Fridman phenomenon.
So just in terms of this kind of broader cultural phenomenon, I was an early critic of Sam Harris.
Yes. Well, he's part of that group.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, he was kind of one of the leading figures of this group, and it kind of turned into a pretty vitriolic personal feud. But to be totally honest, my primary critique with Sam Harris and this whole group that Barry Weiss famously ended up dubbing the intellectual dark web, the kind of these are the people who say the things just that you're really not allowed to say. I always felt like the whole thing was a fraud because I never heard Sam Harris say anything that was even a little bit outside of the mainstream, let alone some sort of dissident or radical thought. I mean, he was a very vehement supporter of the war on terror, which most people were for many, many years under George Bush and Dick Cheney. They got reelected in 2004 based on that agenda. He was an ardent critic of Islam, which isn't exactly reputation threatening when it comes to being somebody in the West. But beyond that, these people always seem so harmless and banal to me, like the the image was very threatening, or the branding was supposed to be radical, and yet the content really never was. So, for example, I mean, someone please tell me, like, for all this talk about how Lex Fridman is just so open to any kind of conceivable idea, who is it that he's putting on his show beside Kanye West? Who, I'll leave that to the side for the moment, but beside Kanye West, who is it that he's putting on his show who's so outside the mainstream that it takes courage to put on? Or what does he have, or does he advocate, or is he even open to that people in good, decent, conservative and liberal society aren't? And I start to feel like this is what ends up being promoted, is this sort of faux radicalism, this idea that if you listen to these people, you're kind of getting the underground conversation, when in reality, all you're really doing is being led right into mainstream orthodoxy.
Exactly. Well, it is interesting that he had a conversation with Kanye. And again, his stature is so enormous that it makes, he couldn't be ignored. His stature is too enormous. And so it makes sense that someone like Lex would be introduced as a potential de-radicalizer, take his shot at it, and it didn't go so well. But it makes sense, given what Lex's role is, that he would have that kind of conversation. And you're absolutely right. Look, there's a tremendous demand for unsafe, anti-establishment, edgy material. There's a tremendous demand for that. But there's a tremendous demand for material that sort of has the simulacrum of that gives the appearance of that, but isn't really subversive at all. And so if we're keeping with this algorithmic theme, if I were, running the regime, if I were gaming this out, I would say, we can't shove explicitly woke content down everyone's throats. They don't like that. So I want to have the most benign, with multiple degrees of remove, but anti-woke adjacent material that's the softest possible thing that sort of satisfies that demand, but ultimately neutralizes whatever kind of subversive effect that could accrue in terms of online content. And I think Lex Fridman might be sort of the equilibrium result there, because he's not even like Ben Shapiro. Ben Shapiro will, deride trannies all day, and then he'll demand that you take the vaccine. That's his sort of two-step, and that's represented more or less by others. Lex Fridman won't, be anti-tranny, but he will be publicly pro-Elon. And so that's and Elon is sort of adjacent to this very safe sort of Rogan tier anti-woke critique. And so he's almost like 2 degrees of remove, but maybe it's determined that's enough to have just enough of that sense of, okay, we're having an open, free conversation. It's the safest it can possibly be, subject to those parameters, and we're just going to blow this up algorithmically and it'll work. And frankly, it has kind of worked. There are a lot of people who like him because he also, despite his faults, does in some ways conform to the mid-wit kind of idiot's idea of what a smart person could look like if you don't look past the buzzwords, because it's like, oh, it's the AI, he's talking with Elon. It checks all the boxes of somebody who doesn't have a tremendous amount of depth, who wants to feel like they're consuming sophisticated content. So it does follow that sort of TED Talk model. And so I guess from that sort of Machiavellian detached perspective, you can appreciate the genius of Lex Fridman as a kind of robotic creation of the regime. And I joke in that context that those Boston Dynamics robots that you see on the internet, they're going to program them to attack anybody who doesn't watch their daily allotment of Lex Fridman videos. We're going to have an internet of things where your refrigerator is blasting Lex Fridman in your face. This is a glimpse into the dystopian future of the completely algorithmically determined intellectual life. And that is something, as somebody who, believes in this sort of life of the mind, who's dedicated a lot of my life to philosophy and so forth, that's what I find most threatening to the human condition about somebody like Lex. It's not even a political thing. It's more of a human thing.
Yeah. I just want to be careful, since I'm not an avid fan of Lex Fridman's podcast, to put that very, very mildly. I think someone in the chat mentioned that he had Alex Jones on. I don't know if that's true, but that is in keeping with the idea that he will kind of, invite on the people that are themselves. I don't know. Someone in the chat mentioned that. So I'm just saying, since I don't know, I just want to be careful about what I'm saying and not saying. But I think that the idea is, for me, whether you can always recognize a true dissident by how they're being treated by the society, right? I mean, you've been, canceled and banned from every sort of place possible. I think the consequences of my own work stand on his own. I could never imagine Lex Fridman even having a post of his removed, let alone, in any way suffering any sort of genuine establishment backlash, because nothing he says is actually even provocative, let alone threatening to the establishment. And for me, a lot of times the proof is in the pudding. Darren, let's just move on in the time we have left. I do want to ask you about the church committee. It's something we've covered a great deal. And by the way, you have on Rumble, on your Revolver News page, what is an amazingly entertaining but also thought-provoking kind of 8.5-minute rant about Lex Fridman that I think is a great companion piece to this interview that I encourage people to go watch. So let's just talk about the church committee and the time we have left. Just this one question I have for you, which is, the church committee has this kind of lore and history, because it really was the first time that Washington was, in a way, forced to talk about these agencies. And right after Watergate and the like, there needed to be this kind of, and it's sort of similar to the Lex Fridman model, this kind of illusion of transparency and reform. And in reality, it almost led to nothing of any consequence in terms of limiting what the national security state could do. There was a FISA court that never existed before, but it really never did anything other than rubber stamp every NSA request, and if anything, gave the NSA more of a legitimacy brand than they had previously. So it kind of strengthened what they were doing because of this fake oversight they now had. How do you see this new church committee, both in terms of its potential and its possible pitfalls?
Well, that's a great question, and we explore this a little bit in a recent piece at revolver.news, but the short answer is that the church committee, just, notwithstanding all of the legitimate critiques of it, represents sort of the best possible case scenario for something like what we're seeing now. And in fact, I think it's too much to expect the results of the church committee, because, well, the church committee was a Senate committee, which had more respect than the House committee. The church committee staffers were meeting in the White House, getting friendly meetings in the White House with then President Gerald Ford. And there are some really incredible stories of Church and his staffers in the Oval Office with President Ford, Henry Kissinger, then a White House speechwriter, Pat Buchanan, and their negotiations about things. But the church staffers got to meet several times in the Oval Office with the president, who was friendly, if not fully cooperative. They got to meet with their relevant point people in the CIA and the FBI and the DOJ. There's no conceivable equivalent of that here. And also, I think it's important to remind ourselves that the public wave of opinion that sort of buttressed church's efforts were in a very different political context. Back in those days, as now, the media was basically left wing. And the media was riding the wave of this Watergate scandal, which was perceived by the public as kind of abuses of a right-wing president against his enemies. There was the Vietnam War. There was the atmosphere of intelligence agencies persecuting anti-war activists. So generally speaking, with some simplification, it was a sort of right-leaning intelligence apparatus persecuting left-adjacent causes and movements, and the media gave its support to the church committee within the context of that dynamic. Now, this is a transformation that you've described so well in multiple different contexts. The national security apparatus has become part of, if not the left, it's become fully homogenized to the ideological bent of every other dominant institution. Whereas back in the 70s, it was more, okay, you had academia and the media on one side and maybe the national security apparatus on the other side. Now we have what the Germans would have called Gleichschaltung, complete conformity, complete homogenization. And that just makes it even more difficult for these poor guys in the House who are, given the task of investigating the abuses of the intelligence agencies, which are now in lockstep with every other dominant institution in American society. And so it's difficult. The practical consequence of this is I think we really need to manage expectations, focus on things very specifically, focus on the most specific handful of things that are easy to ask for politically, but are high leverage in terms of what they could possibly deliver. And one of my sort of pet issues, the best candidate for that happens to be the DNC surveillance footage of the January 6th pipe bomber. And the reason I think that's easy politically is that in theory, everybody should want to find out who this pipe bomber is.
Because he's still on the loose. He's still at large, this pipe bomber.
Exactly. And the FBI just increased its reward for finding out who this person is. So in theory, everyone should want to know that. So it's easy politically, but it's high leverage because if he's found out to be somebody contrary to the narrative, that could be explosive and maybe even the biggest scandal in the country. Or more likely, if you see extreme resistance from the national security community to releasing this footage, the unedited footage, then it starts to look really weird, and that information in itself is valuable. So if they don't pick my pet issue, that's fine, but I think whatever they pick really needs to conform to those parameters. There's a risk of getting totally drowned in an avalanche of information. And if you have this ADD approach to it, you're not going to get anything. Focus on one or two things persistently, don't let go, that are easy, asked politically relative to other things. And that's how you're going to actually get results from the subpoena power of this committee.
Absolutely. I just think, just to conclude there, like historically, it's important to note that the First Church Committee operated at a time when the executive branch was by far at its lowest point and its highest point of vulnerability. At any time in the post-World War II order, there was not only Watergate, but a bunch of Supreme Court decisions that were adverse to presidential power, executive privilege. Culturally, people had turned against the executive branch, that they had bipartisan support in the Church Committee. As you said, the Senate was more prestigious. The people who were leading it were less vilified. And now you're going to have everyone in the world stacked against these House Republicans, including House Democrats, who have no interest in investigating their allies in the U.S. security state. So I think you're right. There is an opportunity if they're smart about it. But I think limited expectations are really important. Darren, it's always a pleasure to speak to you. I really encourage people to follow Darren online, to read Revolver News. It has broken some of the most important stories, especially about January 6th. But this kind of analysis is what you regularly get from Darren. I hope to have you back on the show regularly as well. It's always great talking to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Glenn.
Have a great night, Darren.
You too.
So for our last segment, I wanted to review some of the fallout that took place in Brazil as a result of the live report that we did on Friday night, in which we unveiled what had always been, by court order, secret orders of the Supreme Court, where the judge, a single judge, had the power to order in secret, with no due process or even notification to the targets, that people be banned from the internet, not specific posts, but just these people be prohibited from speaking on every social media platform. The powers were originally justified in the name of the election. The argument was, with the election imminent, we needed to protect the integrity of the election by ensuring that one judge was safeguarding the country from disinformation. And so they were emergency orders justified in the name of the election. Like every emergency power, remember the Patriot Act, surprise, surprise, it seems not to be temporary at all. It continues to endure. The election is over. It happened on October 30th, so more than 2 months ago. And yet this law is still being used, this election law is still being used, as we revealed, to direct with no limits of any kind or any public transparency or need of proof of any kind, people banned from the internet. Now, I have to say that I am a journalist who has been involved in my share of controversies over the years in many different countries and through many different stories, including, of course, the Snowden reporting, where we went all over the world and published the nation's most secretive documents in multiple countries. That, suffice to say, created a great deal of anger toward us and to our reporting. Obviously, during the Brazil reporting itself that we did, that ended up freeing Lula da Silva from prison in Brazil. That culminated in my prosecution, but also months and months and months of threats to my family and all sorts of other things, and many other heretical parts of my journalism career that provoked anger, including my very enduring and vocal skepticism of and contempt for the Russiagate fraud. But I have to say that amazingly, I don't think there's ever been a report that I've done or a position I've taken that has provoked as much intense vitriol and contempt and hatred and enduring attacks, sustained attacks of a very personal nature in Brazil as this reporting that I've done. And I think it's really interesting to ask why. Just to give you an example, I don't know if we can pull this up, but there have been, entire segments on cable news. There you see CNN Brazil. The headline there, which I'll translate, is, has Glenn separated himself from the left with his critics of this judge? Just entire segments about the fact that I expressed criticism of this judge for his abuse of power, one after the next after the next. And I think part of the reason is that there's just kind of a sense of betrayal on the left, that even though the reporting I was doing back in 2019 and 2020 that freed Lula from prison ended up being perceived by the left as favorable to their movement, I kept saying at the time, both to the left and to the right that was attacking me, my cause here is not helping the left. My cause here is not helping Lula da Silva or PT. My cause is a defense of a principle that benefits everybody, which is that before you punish someone and put them in prison, you have to give them a fair trial. And the evidence shows that Lula got the opposite of a fair trial. His trial was one in which the judge was corruptly cheating with the prosecutor in every respect. And it was such a polarizing story that people just assumed I was on the left. So I think part of this anger is based on this idea that I was supposed to be the property of the left. I was a weapon of the Brazilian left. Now they see me turning around and criticizing a judge that they've come to revere as a hero and a savior of the nation. In a sense, in their minds, am defending the Bolsonaro movement when, again, I'm not defending anyone but a principle. The principle being that it's incredibly dangerous to allow a regime of censorship to take hold. So part of it, I think, is this sort of feeling of betrayal. I think part of it is this kind of resentment that I'm an American citizen, technically, even though I've lived in Brazil for almost 20 years, even though my husband's a member of the Brazilian Congress, my children are Brazilian, I pay taxes to the Brazilian government, I have a lot of interest in Brazil. I think a lot of the criticism that came from the right in the past was, how dare you, an American, interfere in our country, whereas the left was always very supportive of my reporting, and this has now changed as well. How dare you try and import your extremist views of free speech that come from the United States into our country, even though Brazil has a constitution that guarantees free speech. But I think, leaving aside the parts unique to me, I think what is really going on here, this fallout that's so intense, and we'll see whether there's any legal fallout from it as well. This judge is incredibly vindictive and has banned and even ordered in prison people who have done nothing but criticize him. I think what's really going on is that once a political movement gets a taste of censorship, the power to silence your enemies, I mean, not only is that so potent, I mean, if you're a political movement, there's almost no power you could hope for that would help your political movement more than the power to silence your enemies through force or even criminalize their ideology, to make it a crime to criticize your views. That's why the US security state is so intent on censoring the internet. It's an incredible power. But I also think it's very intoxicating. I mean, when you get to order your political opponents to jail or get to watch them be banned en masse off the internet, even politicians who, as I said, in the case of this one congressman who was the subject of this order, received the most votes of any of the candidates who ran for Congress in Brazil. All of Brazil, a country of 220 million people, he got 1.4 million votes. To be able to even say to him, we don't care how much popular support you have, in the name of democracy, we're going to take you, the person who the Brazilian people just elected as their representative, and even silence you. I think this power is like addictive. It's inebriating. There's a rush that comes from it. And so when you watch somebody come and threaten to take it away from you, and I mean, I wasn't like I was the first one to criticize this judge. There have been 2 major stories in the New York Times to the credit of the Brazilian bureau chief who aired the concerns about this judge, but I've kind of been banging the table for a long time. This judge isn't just censoring. He's ordering people imprisoned. He's ordering them having their houses search and seized. There are pro-Bolsonaro supporters who are exiled and feel afraid to come back to the country. When I talk to a specialist in the law and in the judiciary or in the Brazilian Constitution, they plead with me to make sure that I never reveal that they're helping me or in any way expressing criticism of this judge, because people fear this judge. As I said, in my entire career, I've never once had the thought in the back of my mind, should I criticize this judge or this political official? Is it really worth the punishment or the reprisals I'm likely to suffer? And that is a real reflection of a tyrannical climate, when you become, as a citizen or a journalist, afraid to criticize a politician or a political official or have to think twice about doing so. That's the climate that has arisen here, but it's very there's a rush that comes from it when a political movement gets hold of that power. And the Brazilian left has that power in their hands. They've watched one of their adversaries after the next get sent to all sorts of punishments at the hand of this one single judge, who they now revere and regard as a hero, even though this judge has a long history of being hated by the Brazilian left. He was one of the people who constantly supported and voted in favor of the decisions of that corrupt judge who put Lula in prison. He supported Lula's imprisonment. He was a member of a government that the Brazilian left considers illegitimate and part of a coup government. And yet now he's sort of taken on this deity status where nobody can criticize him. And so part of the anger comes from my standing up and saying, not as obviously somebody who's part of the Bolsonaro movement, that I find what he's doing very dangerous, but I think they feel like their power that's in their hands is being threatened. And that's what's provoking so much of this fallout. But it tells you a lot about censorship and why it's so dangerous. That if they get to convince you that, oh, they're only going to do it in this one case, they're just going to start with Alex Jones or Fred Phelps or David Irving, this historian who denies the Holocaust. No, don't worry, we're just doing it to the worst possible people. It never stops there. It always expands. Because censorship is an addiction. It's an inebriation. And independent of the effects it has on society, that's what makes it so terrifying, in my view, is the way in which it converts otherwise rational human beings into fanatics and into tyrants. So we will certainly keep following this story. We will keep reporting on it despite this backlash, needless to say. And we will keep doing so regardless of whatever backlash emerges. That concludes our show for this evening. We're a little over time, but we will still, in just a couple minutes, as we always do, move to locals, where we will have our after show that's interactive in nature. We answer your questions. We respond to your feedback. We take your ideas about people we should interview. To join our locals community, all you do is hit the red join button that now I believe is right under the video where this show appears, and you will be a member of the locals community and have full access to all of that. And also starting today, all my written journalism will no longer be on Substack, but on Locals as well. You'll probably have free access to that, the way even on Substack, I publish my written journalism almost entirely for free. I rarely put it behind a paywall, but in the rare cases I do, you'll have access to that and help support the journalism we do. So for those who have continued to watch our show, we're incredibly appreciative. The traffic we produced in January already doubled the entire month of December when we began. We had 2.2 million views in December. We're already, with just the first half of January over, up to 4.4 or 4.5 million views. That exclusive report we did on Brazil's censorship order, even though it was on a Friday night, the slowest night of the week, was watched by more than 500,000 people within the first 12 hours. So we're really grateful for the audience that we're building, the loyalty that you're showing, and we hope to see you back tomorrow night and every night at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively here on Rumble.